Hello and welcome everybody to this Northern Beekeeping chat with Etienne Tardif. Tonight we'll discuss how moisture, insulation, and ventilation affect overwintering honeybee colonies. Etienne is from the Whitehorse, Yukon, and has kept bees there for over 10 years. He collects an astounding amount of data from his hives, and this has informed his management throughout the entire year. Etienne spoke at the Bee Expo this January and has a YouTube channel of his own. I linked it in the comments. Etienne, thank you for coming on tonight, and can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in beekeeping?
Sure. So let's see. How did I get started? So about 20 years ago, I was working at a mine site in northwestern Ontario, so north of Minnesota. And I had a friend geologist who, out of the blue, said, "Etienne, do you want to keep bees?" I just convinced the environment department to buy me some hives to put on as a reclamation project. So at that time, I had no clue about bees, and it was never on my mind. I had zero, I guess, concept of beekeeping, but I've always been curious about stuff. So I said yes. I bought a bee suit. I bought Beekeeping for Dummies. And literally, we were both newbies. Where we were, there was about 1,000 people, so no other beekeepers. So we were on our own. So just reading a chapter of Beekeeping for Dummies as the season progressed was how we managed our bees, because I'd say early 2000s YouTube and stuff hadn't really established itself around the how-to beekeeping. So in a nutshell, yeah. And then did it for about 4 years. And then what happened? I moved to a place called Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and it was too cold there. So I was working in the Arctic at some of the diamond mines. And then I moved to Australia. And then after Australia, I was like, moved to the Yukon. And I said, and I took a year sabbatical, and I was like, I'll get into beekeeping. And that's where I initially bought a wooden box, like wooden colony, which I'd used in the past. And then I bought my first poly hive. And then I ran 2 colonies side by each just to see how they would do. And the rest is history. And then a couple of years later, I bought some brood minders because I was curious about what was going on in the colonies. And I completely went to polys after that first season, just about the performance and how things go. And like we were chatting, weather here, we get frost pretty much year round. Frost free is probably 30 days, maybe. So we had snow this morning, and it was -5. So it's 10. Let's see. Oh, it's only 8 degrees Celsius right now. So and it's midday, or it's 5 o'clock, but the bees are okay. They're all having the orientation flight, and they super adaptable insect.
Yeah, and that's partially because of the poly hives. And would you say that probably over time, the ones that you've have bees now that forage probably at cooler temperatures or fly at cooler temperatures?
I guess the challenge is there's no forage. There's the odd willow right now.
Yeah.
The crocuses are just starting to come out. But I'd say within about 2 weeks to pretty much July, it's just going to explode. So we have
Yep.
1.5 nectar flows. So it's just going to go boom, and you just have to be ready for it.
Yeah. I always, when I talk to Southern beekeepers, I'm like, yeah, I have a short season, but we probably have had our last frost. I mean, maybe not, but we occasionally get frosts in mid to late May. But I think we got our last frost likely about 2 weeks ago, and we won't get another frost till like mid to late October. So I'm a lightweight compared to your season.
But having, again, those polys pretty much eliminates any worries. So I've got liquid feed on them. I've been feeding them since late March, with
Yep.
pollen. So there's all these things I can do in well insulated that you can't do in a wood colony.
Yeah. it's just so much more efficient, right? The amount of heating the bees have to do compared to a wooden box is pretty significant.
And I guess we'll get into it, but it's like us just sitting here, we generate heat without actually wanting to generate heat,
Mhm.
but bees at rest generate heat. And if you have a big enough cluster generating just their resting metabolism or metabolic rate type heat in a well insulated colony with, I guess, managed ventilation, uh, the temperatures in there are warm.
Mhm.
It's about 20 degrees difference Celsius where the bees cluster at. So in a wooden colony, it's about 10 Celsius, which is about 50, I think we were talking about Fahrenheit.
Mhm.
And for a poly with no top vent, it's about minus 15 to minus 20 where they actually start clustering. So you can see how that zone means that they're still at rest. And then they'll slowly start clustering, but that minus 15 cluster is the same as that 10 Celsius cluster. So it
Mhm.
means before it's like ultra tight, it'll be minus 40
Yep.
outside. So
Yep.
hence the reason the bees are generally comfy.
Yeah, and you mentioned you're going to add doubles your second box on, and in my head, if it's that cold, then you'd be worried about adding the second deep, potentially messing up the thermodynamics of the colony. But I'm assuming the polys have something to do with you feeling no worries about that, really.
Yeah, and there's enough. Like I said, I added pollen patties late March,
Hmm.
and the reason I do that, I might as well get into it now,
Yep.
is one, it triggers brood rearing. So then I always keep one temperature sensor above the cluster and one
Hmm.
temperature sensor below at the entrance. So I can see when they're breaking cluster and I can see the brood nests, I guess,
Spike. Yeah.
activating. So I know there's a queen. And then if it's a nice steady around the between 90 and 95 Fahrenheit, then I know there's a queen
Mhm.
in there. Uh, and then what that tells me is good. And then typically I'll get my first inspection in about 3 to 4 weeks later. So late April, early May, I'll do my first inspection. So now I'm actually observing a colony that's gone through one brood cycle.
Mhm.
So then I can see the laying pattern. I can see baby bees. I can see emerging bees. I can see the whole cycle. So if I didn't do that, that event would be in June because
Mhm.
first pollen is May. So they would wait for that first pollen to start brood rearing,
Yep.
which would mean that I wouldn't see that until June, which is too late in my season to react. So by feeding early, I get to see the queen perform.
Mhm.
I can do an early assessment. I can get early queens if I have to, usually mid May. I can get queens shipped up. So then what it does, it gives me an extra month. It gives me a new batch of bees as first pollen happens. So now basically you can start getting a proper division of tasks where now you've got actual real what you call it nurse bees that
Mhm.
are actually from this season, and then the other bees can be foragers and just uh, maximize the pollen. So because prior to doing that, I would never get any swarming. I would never get colonies big enough until July. I would get my July honey flow, but I would never get that June flow. And the June flow, the honey tastes so much better.
Hmm.
So it's like
Well,
it's lingonberries. It's a lot of native wildflowers. It's lingonberry. It's willow. It's all these things that we usually don't really taste in the honey, uh, and it's just sweet.
do you have many invasive species that far north, like
We do
of
have
plants?
we do have clover.
Mhm.
There's Alsec clover and probably some yellow and white sweet clover. Uh, and usually that's starts popping out mid July
Yeah.
to probably mid August. Our first frost is usually early August, but the clovers are pretty tough, so they'll survive uh, that first frost. But most of the natives are dead by early August, and
Yeah.
then yeah.
I was just curious because like very few of the plants, native plants here in Maine, the bees actually go to. They really like the ones. Well, dandelions, of course, are invasive. Sumac. There's this other small plant called bird's foot truffle. There's autumn olive. There's Japanese honeysuckle. So all those are invasive species that the bees like. And so there are a couple ones that they do like they like maple trees. Of course, those are native to North America. But some of the maples they actually are going to are invasive maples from other parts of the world. And so I was just curious to hear because we have, other than like goldenrod and maples, and I guess asters too, very few other plants that are actually native the bees go on to. It's almost all invasive species here.
Yeah, so because of the timing, so my July honey would have the 1 yard doesn't really have any. So folks closer to White Horse, they get a clover flow. Here we'll get a bit because there's some along the road a bit, but there's it's more enough to maintain, give them a feed, and probably help with bringing in extra different varieties of pollen. But yeah, here I've never had there's not enough for a flow of clover honey. So it's mostly fireweed later in the season, and then a bunch of asters and willows, and it's called beer tongue, a pestamon type flower, and meadow type flowers.
Do you have goldenrod that far north?
We do, like Dawson, like further north, they have the Canadian goldenrods, which is that big one that you probably have in the northern states.
Yeah.
But the one we have here, it's called decumbent. It's about 6 inches, 10 inches, and it's more of an arid alpine type goldenrod. Similar honey, and if we get the right weather, a few of the meadows around here just get covered with it. But just remember, it's tiny, so it's I have to cross my fingers to get a honey off of that.
Yeah, it's like here we get it blooms around the 4th of July all the way till like late September. We have so many different varieties of it that bloom throughout the year. And it produces pollen the whole way, but I found that if we get a honey flow, it's in early September, and the temperatures are so wild and such big swings that by far the biggest factor in whether we get a honey flow is it needs to be warm. In 2020, we had one of the worst droughts in Maine history. It was really bad. And I was like, oh, there's no way they're going to make any honey. So I started feeding them in late August before the flow would normally happen. And it was really warm in early September. And so they started pulling in crazy amounts of goldenrod honey. So I'm curious, have you noticed, like, that's the biggest factor for our goldenrod? It seems to be warm temperatures really make it produce well.
Yeah, it's the same. It's warm with just enough moisture, not too much, and you can smell it. So it's my 1 yard actually is on a farmer's. It's a hayfield. It does get a dandelion flow there because the meadow's just jam packed with these big monster dandelions. But there's underfooting of like wild strawberries, and it's called Nangoon berries and gentians. So a lot of native flowers. So, and it's surrounded by willows, flowering willows, and it's the male type. So it does produce nectar, and a really good pollen too. So it's we'll get a mix.
Yeah, you get some of everything. All right. I saw a comment here, Steve Amos. Good evening, y'all. Etienne, really enjoyed your talking at the expo. I've learned a ton from watching your videos. Same. Thanks for having him on. I'm happy to have great guests like Etienne on. It's always interesting to talk with people who have a certain expertise in a certain part of beekeeping. And I can assure you that Etienne has looked at a lot of beekeeping data in his time as a beekeeper. Brian here, do you use Russian honeybees in that northern region using Italians in the far north? He was just curious, what race of bee you're using.
I've mostly got carnies, so mutts, so carnioleans, Buckfast and Saskatraz, I guess, which is a hybrid. I think there's some Russian in there, Russian and Carney mix. The Italians, I think I had a Carney mated with Italian drones. I had all these golden bees this one season in one of my beehives. Tons of bees, but they didn't make the winter. It's just probably not the best bees to have up here. But usually mutts are my favorite.
Yeah. Can you, like, I know it's pretty hard to get queens mated. Could you speak to that? And I'm curious if you've overlapped your yards for queen mating, because I know you buy some queens, but also on occasion some end up trying to mate. How does that work out for you?
Similar. So experiment. I'll usually take a big swarm cell, and then I'll take that frame, put it in a nook with a bunch of nurse bees, feed it, put it in a different yard. So I have 2 yards. I actually have 3 yards. One's a quarantine yard, and then 2 main yards. And then that way there, if I do my splits, I do anything, they're about 10 miles apart. So there's plenty of space so I can just move it to 1 yard. So what I do is I'll take a big swarm cell. I won't actually try anything fancy, and then I'll just put her there. And I've had literally, there's just 1 or 2 more colonies in that yard. And that queen laid, like I've had a few, they'll go for 2-3 years on that.
Yeah.
So I have a feeling that the no pesticides, the no environmental issues make for healthier drones and probably healthier queens. Because there's no other beekeepers.
Short season too.
Yeah. But I've crunched the numbers.
Yeah.
Because if you do the math, because it's still, there's a couple extra cycles in there. There's a few extra cycles, but the math and the size. So a lot of times our colonies get bigger faster than a colony further south. But some places with, like, I don't know, a 4-month winter, those queens will, I guess, based on historical numbers, chances are the bees we have now have less sperm or less quality sperm than they used to.
Yes, for sure. I don't know if this is true or just beekeeping folklore, but I've heard, like, there were beekeepers who, they put on the boxes during the summer, they harvested the honey, and that was about all they did. That was obviously pre-Varroa, but I think that queens also probably used to last a lot longer. And I would suspect that you are onto something with the pesticides. And also, I think it probably can't help that we're using miticides within a colony. And I would guess that maybe has some small part to play, at least, in it. But yeah.
Oh, I guess that's probably not one of those. I'm not going to start sperm counting.
You got to use your microscope for something, Etienne. What are you working on now with it?
I was squishing bee guts just to see if I had amoeba again this year.
Yeah, and all clear.
Mostly clear. A little bit of nosema, a couple bees with amoeba, but no co-infections like previous years. So, and very, very low counts. So, and
when you say very low, what, like, I got a test sent in for, I'm just curious what the actual spore count was.
See, because I do my own, I follow the exact same process or procedure. So it's bee, squish, the same amount of water, the way I mix, the way I squish. I follow exact, and then it's a visual. And then it's basically concentration. I do have one of those counting slide things, but it's just so much work. And for me, a visual is good enough because I can see it. So same with the amoeba, you can see the infected tubules. You can see generally how many of these cysts are in there. And then once you start dissecting bee guts and you start looking at the nosema in there, you can start seeing, oh, this bee really has a bad one, and this bee has a medium one. This one has these sporadic nosema spores here and there.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I know the overwintering food is something you focused on. That's why you started looking at the guts in the first place. So can you speak to the differences between overwintering on sugar syrup compared to some natural honeys, and just explain how that works into your management and how you see the beekeeping here?
I guess there's a story with this one. So back in 2017, I was starting to do that pollen patty in late winter. So finally, my colonies were starting to get big. I'd get really monster doubles. So I had really nice forage forces for when I guess the honey flows would happen. So that one year, I had my biggest harvest. So it was about 50, 70 pounds per colony, uh, which is high for here.
Hmm.
Uh, and the honey was a little bit weird. It was, it had a woody flavor. It was dark. It was molasses like, and I was like, huh. But I didn't know what it was. I just loved it. Peanut butter and toast there. It was just fantabulous. So then I started, that was the year I also tested top ventilation. But really early in the season, in the winter, I could see my bees were in a hyper state. They were noisy all winter. A lot of bees would die out front of the colony. There'd be a lot of dysentery, like poop. Uh, so initially, I thought, oh, it's Nosema, it's something. People would say, oh, don't worry about it, it's normal. And then I was at a conference in Alaska, and I had brought a sample of honey there, and there was a speaker from Alberta, and she said, "Hey, that's probably honeydew." And I was like, "Honeydew," and I had no idea what honeydew was, so I googled it. I had bought my microscope at the time, so and then I started looking into it, and quickly I could see some of these. They're called honeydew elements in the honey itself, and I was like, "Interesting." And then I sent it in to the lab, and the lab came back. Basically, they said it was fake honey, but not really fake honey. It just wasn't in the database. And I'll talk about a bit later around all how honey is not all made the same.
Hmm.
But the sugar profiles, there was a lot of these, what you call it, really complex sugars with really complicated chains. There was these acids, organic acids, and all the numbers were like sky high.
Hmm.
So from a human perspective, beautiful honey, like
Yeah.
probable, really good medicinal values. But for the bees, so that year I lost all my colonies. There was poop everywhere, uh, and you can smell it, and literally, and they all had nosema, and it was just a mess. So, but then I started cluing in on the honeydew, and then the next year I got honeydew again, but it was more of a spruce type. Uh,
Hmm.
and then I was sending all my honeys in for analysis. So now I've tested like 10 of mine. I've tested another 30 in the Yukon because I did a project on honey, and I tested a bunch of BC, different places in Canada honey, just to understand the baseline of honey. So, like a sweet clover is awesome. Uh, but some of my honeys here have a lot lower glucose fructose. So a good wintering honey is usually in the 70 to 77%. That honeydew was at 50%.
Hmm.
So, and that's the honey they use to do ATP to create energy. So because it's low sugar, it has more stuff in it that they can't eat or digest. So it meant that they had to eat an extra 25% to get the same amount of heat. So it means that the accumulation in their guts accelerates. So then we had some ultra cold, so there's no cleansing in winter here. So then they started pooping in the hive, and chances are a handful of these bees had nosema. And then that's probably where things started getting spread. And if I look back on my pictures, I can actually see amoeba spores too, or amoeba cysts. Uh, so then you can see how it just cascaded. probably went exponential. So now, just to answer that question, so most beekeepers in Canada, especially in the prairies, or commercial beekeepers, we don't mess with natural honeys too much. My brood box, I won't touch. So usually the honey's fine. But once I start feeding, uh, I want basically I'll do 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, depending when it is. But I want to fill that back nest. It usually takes about 122 pound bag of sugar equivalent syrup per
Mhm.
hive, and that's all I do. So because that bottom box post winter, or sorry, post summer, is almost already at 100 pounds just from the natural honey. If I notice honeydew in there, I'll pull those frames. I'll leave that middle stuff there because it's there. But then I'll backfill the nest with honey sugar syrup, and it's about 30 pounds of sugar syrup. And that's about it. So that's the extent of the feed that I do. And then typically that gets stored on the outside, and then eventually they'll start bringing in it. So what happens is they're actually feeding on their local honey first in the core, and then eventually everything else is covered by the sugar syrup. So they'll eat sugar syrup, and then whatever was in the bottom of the cells, which is that June honey, they'll get to about now. So just FYI, most of my colonies, I do singles. They still had like 50 pounds of honey in them. So after I feed them in September, and that's the last. And then basically I haven't really fed them yet, other than a bit of fondant here and there to see, to help with that queen rearing trigger. I'll put fondant and the patties. But they're still 20 to 50 pounds. The heaviest was about 50 pounds. That box there, I had trouble lifting it when I was cleaning off the screen bottom board. So it just tells me that they're really not consuming any honey. Which is, if they're like for you, they'll consume a lot more honey. So you have to be extra careful, because sugar syrup honey is 99% pure.
Yep.
Versus honey is anywhere from 50 for a bad honeydew, good for me, bad for the bees, to a clover honey might be 75%.
Yep.
So there's still 25% there of stuff that may mess up their stomach that you need to be careful on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking, I think you talked about this in your presentation at the Bee Expo. How does, like, you were talking about how you think CO2 affects the rate at which the bees eat their honey. Can you speak to that? What you've noticed with your sensors in the hives?
So this past winter, I added a CO2 sensor in my colony, just to trial it. And then from the readings I've been reading, I guess there's probably 2-3 reasons why you'd want average or medium high levels of CO2. Is it makes the bees sleepy, and it'll slow down their metabolism. And what it does is it'll bring them into an ultra low ULMR, so ultra low metabolic rate, which is below the theoretical low. Because a lot of in the research, when you do it in the lab, they'll have the bees, they'll cool the bees down. The CO2 is at atmospheric. So a lot of these charts where we have temperature versus watts, or like metabolic rates or pounds or grams of honey consumed per time at different temperatures, those are in lab conditions. And those are probably, I'm sure they didn't have a CO2 monitor, and chances are it was close to atmospheric. So, and what I've noticed is for most of the winter, it's very much higher than 1%, so 10,000 ppm. That was the limit of my sensor. I wanted to test the category before investing more money in them. Literature says anywhere from 2%. So 10,000 ppm is 1%. So 2% to 4%, so 20,000 to 40,000 ppm is that sweet spot. It's also the spot where you start seeing higher varroa mortality. So where it might actually affect varroa. So hence the reason next year I'm going to have a 100,000 ppm CCO2 monitor in my colonies. I'll probably get a couple.
Yep.
Because I want to answer that. Because right now people say, oh, all you can measure is 10,000. But if you see the chart, it's flat line at 10,000. And the only time it still tells me when they're venting and when they're breaking cluster. I can see drops in the CO2. But they say it needs to be at least that for them to drop that metabolic rate. So for example, that colony with 50 pounds, this is a single. It's not a double, it's a single. So it tells me that they consume maybe 20 pounds from September to May.
That's crazy. It's just
So
yeah.
And the only way they can do that is via this phenomena. So what I'll do is I'll share a paper with you after this that it's on hypoxia. And it's how they probably, the bees that have evolved with a natural level of hypoxia or like able to maintain cavities with high CO2 are probably the ones that make it to spring and don't starve out because they still have leftover honey. And I guess in that other talk, thing to remember too is for every pound of honey, you're producing, what was it again? Almost 2 cups
Water, yeah.
of water or something like that. So, or it's, yes, 60% of a pound is water. And people always say BS because they don't realize when you combust, like even propane, water is a byproduct. Okay, so it generates when you do the chemical chain, one of the byproducts is CO2 and water. So it actually generates more water when you burn fuel on top of the 18% that's there, or the 18%, yeah, that would be there in a theoretical honey. So you'll get an extra amount of water in there that's generated. So hence the reason for me, moisture's probably not an issue, is because of this phenomena is the low consumption.
Yeah.
Means low moisture issues.
Yeah. If someone was living somewhere in the middle or towards the northeast and they didn't have much insulation on their hives, they would eat infinitely more honey. Like I'd say my hives on average, I'm going to be adding some insulation into my tops that I'm making, but even still before that, on average, I mean, they're probably eating at least 40, 50 pounds of honey. I mean, they were solid 9 to 10 frames of honey in September or in October, and now they're down to like almost zero at this point, like very, very little honey at this point. So they've really, they really eat a lot more food. It's pretty a significant amount.
Because that first inspection I did, that one colony had 4 like fully capped honey frames out of 9, because I ran that one with 9 frames.
Yeah.
So, and the other ones were partials, and there was like 3 frames of brood. So, and that's what I mean. There's something there, but the only way for the CO2 to stay in there is, I'd say, without top ventilation. And the other one is if they're clustered, because it's cold around the bees, because in a wooden colony, the temperature outside equal the temperature inside, pretty close with no insulation. So it means your cluster is actually your environment. So the CO2 would be inside, but they have to be careful. And so they can go into hypoxia in a coma, because then they would actually die. So probably they can't, they have to vent out a lot of the CO2 once it goes much below, I guess, 32 or like 0. in a wintering shed. So a lot of these experiments that I'm reading and these studies, they're usually maintaining around the 41 Fahrenheit, so the 4 Celsius. And the bees can handle that. It's at the chill coma, but they can form a nice cluster, a loosish cluster, and be okay. And so there might be higher levels of CO2 in that one.
It's interesting because like I know some beekeepers in northern Maine, they get a lot more snow than we do down here. Like we get, we've had, I think the largest snow we've ever had is like 24 inches. So yeah, that's a fair amount of snow, but they get it more often. And I know some people that have run no top vents. Their hives have been completely covered in snow, which I guess that's the insulation that allows them to possibly enter hypoxia because they aren't able to vent CO2 in that case. If they're completely 100% covered in snow, I don't think they'd be able to vent it. And therefore, it must be the snow acting like insulation that allows them to keep the high levels of CO2 in there. Would that be a reasonable assumption?
So snow is actually, I wish I had more snow
Yeah.
because one for the insulation factor, but the other one is the heat coming out of that lower entrance actually creates a dome.
Yeah.
It'll melt the snow, and unpacked snow actually is breathable. So it will vent, and just from my numbers and once the temperature warmed up, the bees would break cluster and they would naturally vent through that bottom entrance. So they are
Yeah.
able to vent if they have to. And I'd say snow, like puffy snow, is not too bad. If there's a lot of rain, snow, and you get these crust layers, I'd say that's probably where you might get into, I guess, toxic gas type situations. But I'd say in most cases, like you said, the high insulation factor by having your colonies fully submerged is actually probably a good thing,
Yeah.
or it is a
Absolutely.
good thing.
Yeah. We got a great question here. I think I've heard you talk about this before. Do you think side insulation, I think also, but also top insulation, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on both, is beneficial even in a climate where we rarely enter negative temperatures? I'm assuming he's probably talking about Fahrenheit, but still.
I would say for sure top, regardless, because it'll help you with your heat waves. Because one thing to remember too is the the act of adding moisture or water droplets in the colony and then fanning requires energy. Those bees like flapping their wings, fanning, are actually generating respiration in the hives too. So they're consuming
Yeah.
honey. They're adding water to the air. Just to answer those questions, I'd say in Australia they use polys. Why? To keep the heat out, and the bees are better able to manage uh, the inside environment, and they're less affected by these fluctuations. And I'd say there's people I've been interacting with down in in the Carolinas, different places, and they use polys, the same ones I do, a year round, and they love them because bees don't beard as much. They rarely beard, uh, and because bearding is a sign of heat stress. Uh, so I'd say there is an opportunity. It's not going to hurt them. Uh,
Mhm.
and I'd say you don't need to go with 2 inches, but an inch plus wood is like 6R, which is pretty close to a typical poly. A typical poly is around 6 to 7R insulation factor on the walls.
Yeah.
So I'd say, like I tell everybody, have at least 2 colonies and do something different on one, or 4 colonies and do two one way, two a different way.
Yeah.
And like this whole no top ventilation thing, I tell folks, just if you're not willing to jump in, just experiment.
Yeah.
But the challenge is people have to it. And when you have to it, it's usually more detrimental. And when I say have to it, uh, if you're going to insulate, might as well insulate. I'd say in the summer, you probably don't need the sidewalls because it's uh, depending if it's partial shade or where it's at. Uh, but yeah, I'd say for me, I don't see any bad to it other than cost.
Yeah. Yeah.
And ants you probably have a lot of ants that like chewing styrofoam.
Yeah, I don't know if I've had it really happen to me, but I'm sure. And if you're in the southern U.S., that would probably. The
Mm.
one issue is the mice. The mice like to chew the insulation, and I was talking to a beekeeper around a month ago, and she was talking about how she had some insulation on top, and the mouse chewed into it and made a nest inside. Um, so that can be an issue. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And also, I think you talked about this before, but um, you had a theory on how bees would be able to dry out honey faster if they had some top inhalation in the southern part of the U.S. in very humid locations.
Yeah, it's basically it's it more has to do with them being better able to manage those inside conditions,
Mhm.
and they're doing less cooling, evaporative cooling, meaning they're adding less moisture in there, which means that it's they're more pulling that moisture out. But I've looked at the numbers, like it's called vapor deficit
Mhm.
numbers, and yeah, it's pretty crazy what some of these places get, like Kentucky and these places. The humidity is just phenomenal, and the heat, uh, and they're not getting these temperature differentials. Like for me, the morning they're cool is when
Mhm.
my bees dry out the honey. But in warmer climates, it looks like it's the 3-4 p.m. time. Peak heat is when the bees are really. You've got that differential between outside air and inside air moisture levels. So the
Mhm.
bigger the gap, the more they can use that to pull moisture out.
Yep.
So if you know what I mean, uh, and also the bigger the temperature difference inside and outside, the less the bees have to fan to move the air, the more it's a
Yep.
natural convection. So I'd say requires more study. uh,
Yeah.
there's no, it seems to make sense, but there is, I think there are temperatures where your conditions outside are worse than inside. So it's the goal is let's not make it worse by taking the outside condition and putting it inside.
Yeah.
And that's where insulation could help the bees
Yeah.
better maintain that inside
Yeah.
environment.
So the respiration of them having to do the evaporative cooling as well as the natural, if they're doing evaporative cooling, that they're, moving around the water. Both of those factors could potentially increase the moisture within the hive, therefore decrease the speed of the bees that are able to dry out the honey.
Yeah, and it's like I haven't read any studies to see if the bees know when to stop evaporative cooling, when
Yeah.
it'll stop working. So because it's in dry, hot climates, it's a no-brainer. A lot of these houses have evaporative coolers on top because there's a difference in humidity that they can use to actually use that phenomena. But in
Mhm.
really humid places, you there's no point because you don't have that differential on humidity, and so
Yeah.
you won't get the cooling cycle, the natural cooling cycle there.
Yeah.
So
But yeah, so if it is really high humidity in the south, then the bees are just fanning instead of evaporative cooling to cool down. Is that what?
that would be my assumption. I
Yeah.
hope they've evolved or to be smart enough to say, hey, the air is saturated, adding
Yeah.
moisture to it will not help.
Yeah.
But I've never read any studies that have tested that.
Gotcha. We got Castle Hives here. Rainier, hello. Hope, Etienne, hope all is well. We're having a good time. We're getting through the questions. We got Brian. Interesting conversation. Beekeeping in the far north, the bees will adapt. Yeah. And the beekeeper has adapted as well. So that's one part of it too. What was, if you had to say that, what was the one thing that just completely improved your beekeeping the most out of, your last changes in your management practice over the last 10 years?
So other than collecting the data and like mapping out my annual cycle and knowing
Mhm.
all the pollen flows and nectar flows,
Yep.
I would say nutrition, understanding, like adding those pollen patties.
Mhm.
I use pollen patties with 15% real pollen in there. So
Yep.
adding that late winter, and then from late July, early August, I start adding patties again. And the reason I do that is I didn't do that in some yards where the pollen pretty much it became a pollen dearth. I
Yeah.
would see the queens stop laying early August, and basically that these were my winter bees. So without those feedings at either end, it meant my winter bees were like 290, almost 250 to 90 days old.
Wow.
Because that's, but since I've changed now, they're maybe 200s. They're 150 to 200 years old, or sorry, days old. So the understanding pollen and then when to stop, because some
Yeah.
people feed pollen too late, and people don't realize that for a bee to become a winter bee, they cannot be a nurse bee. If they've been a nurse bee, they're going to die. They're a summer bee. So what I do in the fall is I start in early August. I'll just keep 1 pound, 1 pound patty on there, and just continue supplementing until uh, early September. Probably by the first week of September, no more pollen. I'll give them another bulk syrup feed, and that'll be it. But what that does is the queen will stay stable. She'll keep laying flat. And then once I pull those pollen patties, then she'll slow down. So it
Mhm.
tells me that all these bees that are merging now will not have eggs and larvae to nurse.
Yep.
So it means that all of those bees will become winter bees from that point on, which
Yep.
is exactly what I want. Where
So go
and then
ahead.
it's managing that age. And then
Yep.
by the feeding in March, late March, it triggers that first round. It just means that the gap between old bees and young bees is much, it's still big by normal standards, but it's manageable. Bees, like I said,
Yeah.
I was always getting good successes, but I could never get my bees to swarm. But since I've been doing this, now I have plenty of bees to do splits and do stuff with, uh,
Mhm.
which I didn't really have before. And they'd always be ready in July for the fireweed flow, but I didn't even know there was a flow in June because I didn't have enough bees in my boxes.
Yep. So that dialing in the feeding calendar has really helped improve your bee's health. I had actually never heard that about the nurse. Like if a bee becomes a nurse bee, they can't become a winter bee, is what you're saying, or they won't be. They'll die pretty quickly.
Because they use these APG
Hypophagia.
glands, and then they actually start producing brood food, and so they're actually not storing the phytolylogen, that
Yep.
the Vito in
Keeps
their
them.
fat bodies. So, and they need a healthy level of that
Yep.
to be able to become nurse bees in late winter, spring,
Yep.
because they'll use their fat reserves for that first round of bees. Uh, but I'm preempting that by saying, hey, let's not even wait. Let's just go.
Well,
And
yeah. Yeah. I feed pollen patties in late March. So yeah, you feed them pretty early, but it makes sense. I was like, well, what if I ever tried to feed them earlier, but I don't have the, decreased moisture levels and I do mostly feed them so they pretty much have completely clean food source. I'd say it takes about 40 to 50 pounds of sugar per hive for fall feeding for them to, properly maintain or get enough weight. But what I'm really breeding for in my bees, because I rear my own queens, is I have some that are just way better at going from baseball, softball size cluster to 4 or 5 frames of brood in a few weeks in the springtime. Like I had one that I didn't give them any extra brood. They overwintered. They had like 8 frames of honey left, and they came into spring, maybe the size of a softball size cluster. And then when I looked at them, that was March 31st. And then when I looked at them this week, they were up to like 4 or 4.5 frames of brood. So they just were able to expand really, really quickly. And I had another one, they were at like 3.5 frames of brood a month ago. And then I looked at them this week and they were at 7 or 7.5 full frames of brood. So some of them just really exhibit that trait of just expanding incredibly quickly and overwintering on smaller amounts of food. So hoping to move in that direction.
Nice.
We have Caleb Long with another question here. Etienne, do you have a fall flow in your area where you're at?
So that's July.
That's a nice fall. Yeah.
That's late July. So technically we'll have our killing frost early August, closer to town. So I'm in a microclimate here. I didn't know about the climate here before I bought my place. If I knew what I knew about my place, I'd still probably live here, but we get an inversion. So we're about 10 degrees cooler here, 5 to 10 degrees cooler than town in the day low. So we get, because we're in the mountains, you'll get that flip. So we're getting -5, -10 right now. In town, they're getting 0.
Yeah.
So there they get a lot of invasive, so hawkweed and clovers.
Yeah.
They'll get a flow into September.
Yeah.
A clover flow.
Yeah. Well, if it makes you feel any better, Etienne, I call it a fall flow in early September, but that's not really technically fall yet either. So I actually, since I've been a beekeeper, I just think of September when the calendar gets to September, I'm like, oh yeah, that's fall now. I didn't even really realize it didn't technically start till late September. And in my head, that's the fall flow. That's when fall starts.
Yep.
You just get that idea in your head. And but yeah, your fall flows in July, so that sounds fun.
It is for my work life. It actually lets me do intense beekeeping for 3 months, 4 months, and then put the babies, the bees to bed. And when I do my talks and when I talk to beekeepers, is you need to be 100% confident that your bees will make it through winter. You need to get to that point. So what are you not doing to be that confident?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say, people always say, oh, you must be worried about your bees. I was like, no, they'll be fine. And they get 80, 100% through the winter, most winters now. And I think I've solved my Nosema and amoeba issue with fumigation. So I think I'll be in the 90s to 100% now.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. This is exactly one of the questions I want to ask you. How did you get to that point? Like, walk us through how you developed that whole yearly plan, through your observation and whatnot, other factors.
One was, like I said, I had a dog. We did a lot of dog walks, and I was looking at all the plants in the environment. So I find bees have helped me connect with nature a lot better, because now you notice things that you never noticed before. So I'd say understanding that. And like I said, that first $30 sensor I put in a colony on top of the brood nest. And I did that. I had 2 sets. So I did 2 colonies. And then I noticed these temperature patterns around the queen and when she laid and when she stopped laying. So that clued me in on, oh, shoot. Okay, she's shutting down early August. So, but winter's coming. It's really long, and they won't really start till May, June. So what do I need to do to be able to do that? So hence the reason I started managing the food. The other one was going to singles, because it's, for me, I guess if you insulate, you'll see it's about number of bees to the volume.
Yeah.
Is that ratio you're looking for. And the higher the insulation factor, the fewer bees you need in that box. Okay, but the more bees you have in that box with insulation versus the volume, the less honey they'll consume,
Hmm.
uh, which is an important thing. So I like singles, and then adding that honey super in, I'd say, early June. So I'll feed. I might do light liquid feed now just to stimulate the queen and to get some things going before nature does it. Uh, so what that does is the queen will go up. She'll lay in the honey super. A couple weeks later, I'll chase her down. I'll put my excluder on, and usually that solves the swarming issue or the swarming opportunity. I'll do
Hmm.
my splits in. I'll usually do a couple colonies with doubles,
Yep.
and those will be the ones I do splits on. Uh, and then what it does, like for instance, this year or this summer, I have to travel a lot for work. And I've got a week or two between trips, 3 week trips. So I have enough time and I can use my method single, I'll add a double.
Yep.
Then I leave for 3 weeks. I'll come back, I'll add a honey super with an excluder. Uh, I'll make sure there's feed on it. And it was data driven. I mapped out the climate. So even when I was doing my queens, trying to figure out what the best time to do queens are, uh, I noticed that early June, we always get a cooling period here. It rains for 2 weeks, and it did
Hmm.
that for 25 years. Last year was an exception, but doing the average of the last 25 years, early June was
Yep.
always cold and wet. So that helps uh, me decide what to do there. Doing my honey project, uh, I understand the honey now, the good, the human good, but what's good for the bees. Uh, I know what's in their gut because I taught myself how to look at pollen. So by looking at what they're eating, then you know what they're foraging on. Uh, Knowing these invisible diseases around nosema, and because a lot of times the dysentery might just have to do with the type of honey. It might be fermented honey or bad honey or sugar syrup that went bad. There's different
Hmm.
reasons. Uh, so there's all these. It's information based, and
Yep.
so just to go really quick, early, late winter at Paul and Patty, do my first inspection in late April, early May. I assess the queen because I'll have a full brood pattern in there. If I don't, I need to do something. And then a couple weeks later, maybe I'll add some light liquid feed. Then I'll add a honey super probably early June. I'll let the queen go in there. And then a couple weeks later, I'll put an excluder in, chase her down. Then I
Hmm.
might add a second honey super on there. Then I just pretty much leave it till if we get maybe rain once or twice every 2 weeks, we're pretty good. If it gets too hot, dry, then I may have to pull the honey supers.
Yeah.
I did I do OAV in the spring and I do it in the fall. I do usually one or two treatments each, and usually that's enough to deal with my mite issues. And then I'll pull my honey late July, early August, and then I'll quickly put on a bulk liquid feeder. I'll start with probably a liter or two, so like a half gallon initially of light
Hmm.
syrup, and that's just to get them feeding. I'll see how quickly they take it down. If they take it down really quick, then I'll go put say 2 gallons in the feeder. I'll just because they're taking it quick, they're hungry. I'll just put 2 gallons, and then I'll do that a couple of times. And usually by the end of August, they're at weight, and I'll do one more feed just to give them feed something to do and maintain. Uh, and then by mid September, I'll put the colonies together. I'll hug so they share a wall, but I won't wrap them yet.
Hmm.
Okay. Uh, and then what I'll do in October, I'll pretty much put and I'll put that extra insulation on top where I use a deep box. I put 4 sheets of styrofoam in there. So then I've got that R40 on top. And then that bottom one has a little slot in it cut. So I could put my pollen patties in there in the late winter. So then eventually I'll wrap that with a bubble foil, and I'll put extra wind protection and maybe an extra sheet of 2-inch styrofoam on the north side.
Yep.
And that's my winter setup. And then they'll be like that until just before I do that, I usually pull my screen bottom board because they're all sealed up underneath. And what it does, it gives space for the moisture, any condensation to drip down.
Yep.
And then literally the cycle continues in
The next
late
year. Yeah.
March again. Yeah. So it's pretty easy. And then for splits is sometimes I'll overwinter a double that was really, really good that I know I'll have to requeen. It'll have 2 boxes, and then come spring, pretty much just double it by a queen for the other one, a June queen. And then that's how I maintain my numbers or grow my numbers.
Gotcha. I think that's a great framework. And one thing that really helped me figure out what the bees were bringing in is knowing that when they fly out on a trip, they almost always pollinate the same flower over and over again. So if you see a bee on a dandelion, you look at what pollen's on the bee's legs, you're going to know very likely what color the pollen is. So, when I see orange pollen in the hives now, since I'm able to see the bees out on the dandelions with that orange pollen on them, I'm able to figure that out. Nectar, obviously, not the same, but that being able to know what pollen they're bringing in definitely makes a big difference.
It does.
Yeah. We have 2 questions here before we end it out. Have your bees become darker in color through the years as becoming extreme northern mutts, and how are their temperament?
No to the color, because most of them are actually coming from the British Columbia, like around Vancouver area mutts. So the ones I made it up here are usually black because they're carnies. And I'd say temperament. I just opened up a colony yesterday to put my feeders on, and it was windy and cold, and a bunch of them got chilled and comatose on the front. But yeah, they're calm. They're not a bit of smoke. I don't really have to smoke most of the time. They're nice and calm.
Well, you get to 100% control the genetics. So any queen, not from the ones you buy in, but any of the ones that are mated, you know exactly who they're mating with. It's not exactly a mystery.
No.
We have one last question here before we end it out. I've not heard of amoeba affection before. Is that a northern ailment? What are the symptoms?
What I'll do is I'll share an article with you. It's printed 6 months ago on ABJ, so you can share it with your folks there. But it infects. It's called Malpighian tubules, so it's like the bee's kidneys. And so it does affect osmoregulation. So if you'll see it, it's like filling your kidneys with marbles, and it looks really, really painful. And what it is, it's usually a lot of times a co-infection with Nosema. So Nosema is an energy robbing. It's in your gut. This one here affects the transfer of moisture from the gut to the hemolymph. That's what these tubules do.
Yep.
And so what it does is if the bees can't manage internally their moisture, so you can see how dysentery and all these other things could be a bigger problem. And I'd say places where you have winter cleansing occasionally, say once a month, it'll probably be not as you probably have it because I did send a lab down to the University of Florida, and then I was working a person there I guess she was able to do a PCR test on it from a new protocol, and it was fun. Got my name on a published paper, but one of the researchers there who was helping her noticed these cysts in my bees.
Yeah.
And then he actually noticed it in their apiaries bees. while he was doing some Nosema research, and then they
Yeah.
tested it to confirm it. In Minnesota, I've heard of a place where the bees puke out. So one of the symptoms is a lot of dead bees in front of the colony.
Yep.
In the spring, I would go with, say, a colony, a double with like 16 frames of bees. And within a month, there'd be 0 bees in there. So all the bees go and fly off and die somewhere in the spring.
Yep.
And they can't raise brood effectively. Okay, so just to finish that thought is last year I had one colony that was queenless coming out of winter, and I had one colony that was infected with amoeba and nosema. I could see the queen was laying eggs, but the brood wasn't going anywhere. And every bee I tested in there had amoeba and nosema. So what I
Yep.
did is I took that queen and I put her in this queenless colony, and it started laying crazy pattern. The bees raised a bunch of new bees. It's overwintered now, and it's got 3 frames of brood. So it tells me that this queen didn't get infected with this, but it was the bees themselves that are infected that can't raise the new bees. So anyways, it's if you have dwindling colonies and all that, there's a few different things. I'll share the paper there, and I have the full story in there.
Yeah, I'll put it in the comments. Last comment here. This was a great information for northern beekeepers. Was an awesome discussion. Thanks for coming on, Brian, and we really appreciate you coming on here tonight, Etienne. Is there anything you'd like to tell people, and where can people find you as well?
Like I said, there you've got the was it North of 60 Beekeeping, I think it's called, and on YouTube you can just look up my my name there. But it's there's some geeky posts in there. Because I love numbers and research, so I even have some microscopy ones in there. So for folks, if you are part of a club, I say the key is be curious, ask lots of questions. There's no stupid questions, and compare things. And ask yourself why. Why is this the way it is? And I'd say that's what I do in my work life, and I do it in my bees. It's just there's no question that I don't think a beekeeper who's determined can't answer. So like this amoeba took me 5 years to figure it out, and I had to get these researchers to confirm my hypothesis. Same with discovering honeydew, just questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you can take your victory lap around that amoeba.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming on tonight, Etienne. Thank you everyone else for watching. I really had a good time talking to you. So yeah, thanks, Etienne.
No worries. All the best, and stay in touch.
All right. Sounds good. Good night, everyone. Hope you have a great time.